Trump is sounding off about the latest convictions against his former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, saying, quote, "I feel very badly for Paul Manafort and his wonderful family. Justice took a 12-year-old tax case, among other things, applied tremendous pressure on him, and unlike Michael Cohen, he refused to make up stories in order to get a deal. Such respect for a brave man." A large number of counts, 10, could not even be decided in the Manafort case. Witch hunt. That'll be the end of the tweet. And this is just the president's latest defense of Manafort. Listen to this.
Manafort has nothing to do with our campaign. But I tell you, I feel a little badly about it. They went back 12 years to get things that he did 12 years ago.
I think the whole Manafort trial is very sad. When you look at what's going on there, I think it's a very sad day for our country. He worked for me for a very short period of time. But you know what? He happens to be a very good person. And I think it's very sad what they've done to Paul Manafort. I feel very badly for Paul Manafort. Again, he worked for Bob Dole, he worked for Ronald Reagan, he worked for many, many people. And this is the way it ends up.
Manafort had nothing to do with our campaign. That'd be a straight-up lie. Months ago, the New York Times reported the idea of a pardon for Manafort, and Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, had already been floated by Trump's lawyer, John Dowd, who's since resigned. Let's take a look at how any pardons would actually work. The president can forgive someone for a crime or excuse someone from punishment. It's listed in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. We should also note that the president can extend a pardon to someone who's not yet even been convicted of a crime. While it's broad, there are some limitations that apply here. First, a presidential pardon can only be extended to those convicted of crimes in a federal court. That's the case for Manafort. Had he been facing charges in a state court, the president would not have the power to pardon him. Now let's look at the pros of a pardon for Manafort. At first glance, Trump extending a pardon is completely legal. This is an executive power. Congress cannot reverse or stop a pardon. On the flip side, while Congress has absolutely no say in presidential pardons, if they found the president is abusing pardons for corrupt purposes, which this might be, they still reserve the right to pursue impeachment, which we discussed earlier requires a simple majority in Congress, but 2/3 of the Senate. Here with us now is former Deputy Assistant Attorney General under George W. Bush, Tom Dupree. Also joining us is former Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Daniel Goldman. Guys, thanks for being with us. Tom, let me start with you. Michael Cohen's lawyer, Lanny Davis, said today that he wouldn't accept a pardon if Trump even offered one up. We don't know if that's true, but that's what his lawyer said he would say. With Manafort, is there any reason for him not to accept a pardon from the president?
I don't see any reason why Paul Manafort would not accept a pardon from the president. In fact, one school of thought is the very reason why Manafort was willing to roll the dice, go to trial, rather than take a plea, as so many other people have in the Mueller investigation, is precisely because he thought there might be the possibility of a pardon down the road from the president. The other option that the president could at least consider is whether to commute Manafort's sentence, which would mean even though the conviction would still remain, he wouldn't end up serving jail time.
Let's talk about that, Daniel, for a second. Michael Flynn has not been sentenced yet. He's pleaded guilty. Papadopoulos, the special counsel, said didn't provide substantial evidence, and the government, the Mueller investigation, has not challenged what the sentencing guidelines for him would be, 0 to 6 months. But he sent out a weird tweet, I think it was yesterday, saying decision time. What could the president? Do a few things, accomplish a few things by suggesting a pardon for Manafort, and would he do it now?
Well, I absolutely think that Manafort is playing the pardon long game here. And we will know that almost for sure by September 17th, when this trial in Washington, D.C. is set to begin, because the time to cooperate, the last best chance is right now.
Right.
And interestingly, Manafort's lawyer, when he got out of court yesterday, did not say, as many defense lawyers do, we will appeal this. We have many issues.
Considering all his options.
We are evaluating our options, which is an indication they're thinking about a lot of things. I have thought for a long time that Manafort is playing the pardon game, in part because there's no other sensible rationale to choosing to have two trials.
Right.
It only benefits the government. And so when you start to see Donald Trump's tweets and statements about you're a good guy and he's treated unfairly, which mirror some of the statements he made about other people that he's pardoned, the writing is quite obviously on the wall. As to Flynn and Papadopoulos, we're starting to see a little bit more into the recesses of Mueller's investigation. Not the substance, but some of the background stuff. First of all, Papadopoulos apparently attempted to cooperate, but was unsuccessful because he didn't tell the truth.
Right.
So he's wiped out. And he's lower level, so he's not as important. But Michael Flynn's sentence being extended indicates that there is still an ongoing investigation where Bob Mueller and the special counsel's office needs Michael Flynn and his potential testimony. And that is significant because it means that there's very potentially more coming down the pipe.
Remember, Tom, we knew about Manafort and his involvement long before we knew about Michael Cohen paying off these two women. There are a lot of Americans who are sitting there saying all they needed was the evidence that Michael Cohen produced that he paid these women with the intention of influencing the election. But others say really Manafort and what he knew about the Russians is more important right now. And it does seem from the president's tweets that he's actually worried more about Manafort and what he could say than what Michael Cohen's already said for some reason. I'm not sure why that is, but he does seem to be more concerned about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And honestly, the president seems, I think, should be worried about both separate prosecutions. As far as Manafort goes, look, the question is, what, if anything, did Manafort know about the campaign's involvement with the Russians? I tend to think that there is a good chance that Manafort actually doesn't have an enormous amount of information to give Mueller, because if he had, maybe we would have seen a plea bargain earlier in the process. Of course, it is also possible that Manafort is playing the long game, as I said earlier. That would be one explanation as to why he was willing to roll the dice and go to trial. I do think the next few months are going to be telling, because if Manafort's second trial goes forth and there's another conviction, I mean, at some point, the opportunities for Manafort to cooperate with Bob Mueller will have evaporated totally.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.